Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode, we're going to talk about the Harry Turtledove novel, How Few Remain, the first work in a very long series, a series which is known as the Southern Victory series, a series which is 11 books long. So this is number one with a bullet right here.
So this book, How Few Remain, sort of starts off this really vast series. It's one of the better ones out there, just as a heads up. Basically, if you've ever heard of Order 191, what happened is that a Battle of Antietam occurred because this order that General Lee had been sending out to his various commanders, a copy of it just got lost. It was found wrapped around some cigars in a field in Maryland, and Confederates had moved on. Union troops came through the area, and one soldier just happened to find it. He looked at it, and then he gave it to his superior, and it sort of went up the chain. And then there's a famous quote, McClellan said, it's this, with this, I'll whip Bobby Lee. And it turned out that way. But he managed to force a battle, first at South Mountain, then at Antietam. The war sort of went on from there. But in this story, the courier who dropped it in reality is about to leave when some soldier sees some cigars laying around and says, "Hey, sir, you dropped this." And he's like, "Oh, thank you so much. These are very secret orders. Here, have a cigar. Good job, buddy." And from there, General McClellan doesn't know where Lee's troops are placed. So eventually he maneuvers around a bit, and there's this final battle at Camp Hill in Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River, where the Confederates win this smashing victory. Britain and France then intervene afterwards and say to the Union, you need to recognize Confederate independence, and the Confederacy becomes independent.
And as a result of this, Lincoln never publishes the Emancipation Proclamation because he was waiting for a big victory to put it out there, so it didn't seem like the Union was desperate. And in real life, he did it after Antietam, which, maybe that's not a big victory or anything, but it's certainly not a gigantic defeat like this.
Yeah, this is Philadelphia gets occupied by the Confederates and all that. And I can't remember if it's this or the prologue of one of the later books where the British ambassador goes to President Lincoln and he's talking about what's going on. And President Lincoln's like, "Well, in my desk," and he pulls open a drawer and he explains it's the Emancipation Proclamation. And the British guy, the ambassador, is like, "You can't release this. This is just going to be seen as sour grapes," as sort of a desperate move by a defeated nation. So what happens is, the Confederacy wins its independence. Missouri and West Virginia stay in the United States, though. But Kentucky becomes part of the Confederacy.
And the Oklahoma Territory goes to the Confederates, and it becomes the state of Sequoia.
Yes.
Which is this state where all these Indian tribes are given a ton of autonomy. They're left to their own devices, basically.
And also, the Confederacy buys Cuba in between the 1860s and the 1880s.
I think it's 1870 it happens.
Something like that. And also, just a few things to note is that the French incursion into Mexico succeeds because of this.
We got good old Emperor Maximilian still kicking around.
And what happens is it picks up in 1881, and it talks about what's going on, the sort of status quo on the North American continent. But what happens is the Confederacy wants to expand. It wants to reach coast to coast, just like the U.S. does. So it decides to purchase the Mexican states of Chihuahua and Sonora from Mexico, which is strapped for money and for cash. So because of that, James G. Blaine, who is the president of the United States, he's the first Republican president since Lincoln, who was only a one-term president, clearly, because of this great defeat, and he's sort of in disgrace. He threatens war over this, and then it comes to a head. But there's more I think we want to talk about as well, just about sort of the nature of the book itself.
Right. In this book, it is a series of point of views following, let's just call them celebrities from our own timeline. For instance, we have point of view characters with Lincoln and Stonewall Jackson and
Frederick Douglass, Jeb Stuart, George Custer, Theodore Roosevelt. Mark Twain.
Alfred
Schlieffen, the guy who wrote the Schlieffen Plan.
That's right. So these are all people that we know from our own timeline. So it's pretty grounded in what we know about history, and that's interesting because you get to see this altered world through their eyes. And Turtledove gets to write about these historical figures, but it's kind of a weakness because of that, your view of this world is pretty limited. You're seeing the world through the eyes of these military people in the North and South and some civilian people in the Union, in the USA. but you don't see any civilian perspective at all in the Confederacy. For instance, you don't see any slave point of view at all. You only hear little bits about what slavery is like in the CSA.
And also, that's a point we've forgotten to mention, that slavery, as of the start of the book, is still legal. That slavery has been abolished in the United States, but not in the Confederacy. It's mainly focused more on the military and the big players. We're going to do another episode about the other books, at least the Great War series, and that does a better job of expanding out to talk about other characters. But also, I think it's okay that they do this in How Few Remain, because it's only 19 or so years, like roughly 20 years removed from this change. So yes, the world has changed, but it's not enough time to alter it completely.
Right.
So what happens is basically the U.S. invades the Confederacy, and then there's some fighting, and there becomes like this Stalingrad-style battle in Louisville, in which the U.S. gets bogged down. There's fighting out west. Is it Britain invades northern Maine? And
that's right, yeah.
They bombard the coast, they bombard San Francisco, and then they actually invade Montana, where the U.S. wins its only real victory. Teddy Roosevelt and George Custer team up together to defeat this British attack.
With the magic of machine guns.
Yeah, Gatling guns.
Yeah.
Custer doesn't want to use them, but...
but Theodore's like, that's a good idea. Let's totally use those.
And basically the point is the Confederacy wins. The Confederacy keeps Chihuahua and Sonora. I can't remember if they get any other territory. I don't think there's any other territory that they take from the U.S. I know the British take part of northern Maine for some reason.
It's really bad for Blaine because he's from Maine, so he's very unhappy about that. Which is why, like, at the very end of the book, he creates this holiday called Remembrance Day, which is like this big revenge. Like, let's all remember the fact that we lost a really big, embarrassing war twice in a row against the Confederacy.
Yeah. And what they taught, it's interesting too, is that as they're doing that, like Schlieffen is witnessing a lot of what's going on. Like there's a bombardment of Washington, D.C., and he's like the Prussian military attaché. And at the end, you sort of see the U.S. starts to gravitate towards the German Empire. They're sending out feelers, we want to be more like you, sort of stuff like that.
I love the part where Schlieffen is talking to General Rosecrans,
who was a U.S. general, not very good in the Civil War out, and he fought like the Battle of Chickamauga and stuff like that.
Well, he's not very good in this book either, because he like asks him, so sir, what's your plan for this whole war? And it's like, there is no plan. We're just making it up as we go along. That's the American way. And he's like, what?
Yeah. It sort of covers all this, and at the end of it, the Confederacy has won this victory, and they look empowered, and Britain and France are still very much their allies. Although, compared to other books, this one focuses way more on the military side than it on the civilian side. Although, the Mark Twain thing is interesting because it's sort of an insight into, like, civilian life in the United States.
Yeah, and he's like a journalist, so you get perspective on some things that aren't maybe seen through the eyes of certain characters, so he can go over the big picture for the audience. Like, oh, so-and-so said this about that, and Blaine's a complete moron.
And Lincoln's in this. It's interesting. He's still alive in the 1880s, and he plays an interesting role because the Republican Party is fractured and smashed by the end of this book. They've been associated with 2 failed U.S. wars, and Lincoln becomes the head of the Socialist Party or something like that, right, Max?
That's right. He meets up with the leader of what would eventually become the American Communist Party. Throughout the whole book, he's been agitating. He's been going from town to town and giving these speeches about like the rights of the worker and these capitalist wars are tearing us apart and stuff. And eventually the loss of what's called the Second Mexican War is what precipitates him saying, I'm cashing out of the Republican Party. I'm going to take all the people that still like me, my supporters, and I'm going to move to the Socialist Party. And as a result, the Socialist Party gets a huge shot in the arm as a result of this.
Yeah, and also the Democratic Party becomes the main party in the United States. And they mention it more in the later books, but they talk about how it's like 30-some-odd straight years of Democrats being elected president. So,
yeah. Like, for instance, kind of spoilers, but eventually when we get to later in the series, a certain president who was a Republican in our timeline is a Democrat in this one.
Yeah, stuff like that. So they've become the majority party. It's a very good book. There's some parts of it that I wasn't as much a fan of, like Jeb Stuart's in this, and he spends a whole lot of time just sort of running around the desert.
That's right. He's out in, I think it's Sonora. What he's trying to do is bushwhack the U.S. forces using Apaches as allies, and then later there's some bad blood between Apaches and Mexicans, and he's forced to turn around and start trying to kill the Apaches, and basically none of this is really important for the series as a whole. Speaking of the Jeb Stuart stuff, I really like the part where they use camels against the the U.S. I think that's pretty cool.
And I think this is sort of, and I've seen this in other books, I really like Harry Turtledove. I think he's a great writer. But occasionally he'll get off on these tangents. And that just felt like with the Jeb Stuart thing. And same thing with Mark Twain, he's called Samuel Clemens in it.
Right.
Is that at times it feels like this isn't focusing on giving a better picture of the world. It's an interesting dalliance or whatever. But they have some great quotes in here. I think, what's the one that you have down about George Washington's pretty good.
I like near the end of the book, there's a United States character which says, "I'm beginning to think that George Washington was nothing but a filthy Virginian."
Yeah, and there's also another thing interesting that they've got this becomes an interesting trope that runs through later, is that in Utah, the Mormons sort of declare independence.
That's right. They rip up all the railroad lines and cut the telegraph wires, and they stop communicating with the U.S. government. And the U.S. government, after the shock of the Civil War, is not having that. They're not okay with secessionism. So they come down real hard on the Mormons, really hard. Mm-hmm. They roll into town and track down the president of the Mormon religion and hang people, burn down people's houses, really, really strongly alienating people. And I believe at some point it's mentioned that Mormonism becomes illegal in the United States. Maybe that's in the sequel.
No, I don't think it becomes illegal, but it becomes like they sort of are under a very watchful eye, and they're seen as sort of like a restive minority. But the thing is that later bears fruit in the Great War series, and we'll talk more about what happens there.
Yeah.
You can clearly see when he wrote this book, he was laying the seeds for a much wider series of books and much wider sort of going on.
I remember when we were talking about doing an episode about the Great War books, you told me you don't have to read How Few Remain. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just do it anyway because it'll give more insight. And having read The Great War and having read How Few Remain, even though I like How Few Remain, I think it's good. If you are just a big fan of World War I and you want to read an alternate history book about World War I, you can totally just skip How Few Remain because it sets up a lot of stuff, but it's definitely not necessary to understand what's going on.
I didn't read How Few Remain first. I actually didn't read the books entirely in order, but the Great War books, but that's because that's the way I got them. But it's good. It fills out some nice background information, but the other 10 books, I do agree that you should read those in order. How Few Remain's good. It's a really good book, but it's not necessary to read. But I would recommend you do because it will give you a nice basis to build from.
Yeah.
Like, I like how they ultimately win the big victory against the British is in Montana. And that's Custer's big victories in Montana, which is funny because, that's where the Battle of Little Bighorn was.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. And also the fact that, we didn't really go into this, but Custer's still alive at this point.
Yeah, well, because, and they hint at it in later books that basically because the U.S. lost against the Confederacy, they're like, we need some sort of military victory. So they just pummeled the Plains Indians very soon afterwards. And there just never was a Little Bighorn. Also, Teddy Roosevelt is the leader of the unauthorized regiment, is what they call it, which is the Rough Riders. This is just 17 years earlier. There's little stuff like that. So if you're a history buff, you'll like these little references they throw in there.
Also, I guess because Gatling guns were never used in the Civil War because it ended so soon, it's totally untested. And it's like, what are these things? They call them, I think they call them coffee grinders or something.
Yeah, something like that. It's been a while since I've read the book, so. But I do like how, they use them and they just devastate. No one is even expecting it. Like they use them against the British, and the British are just stunned.
Yeah, the British are using lancers against them, and they're like, "What are you doing?
Yeah,
why?"
No, it's very good. That sort of stuff is interesting, and I like that they include that, and that they cover different fronts. That you've got like your Kentucky, and then there's down south with Jeb Stuart near what I believe they just call. I think in Mexico and Arizona is just called New Mexico. Then you got up north in Canada and Montana and stuff like that. So it's an interesting variety.
By the way, Dakota is just one state in this series.
Yes.
It's not north or south. It's just
Dakota,
a big blob.
It's an interesting, I looked into that. I was like, why was that? And it turned out because in real life, North and South Dakota really was supposed to be just one state, Dakota. But they split it in two because they were both it was a Republican stronghold of the state, and they wanted to get more senators in the late 1800s. So they're like, we're going to split this state in two. There really was no purpose. Dakota was supposed to be just one state.
But in this world, the Democrats have such a death grip that it's not a big deal.
Yeah, well, there's no need for it because the Republicans become sort of foreshadowing for the later books is that they talk about them occasionally, but the Republicans are like a small regional party like in the Midwest. Like they've got some seats in Indiana and Ohio. That's about it. It's basically the socialists and the Democrats have become the two parties.
Oh, and we talked a little bit about this, but like Mark Twain's out in San Francisco after the Civil War. He moves there to be a journalist, and
he's a successful journalist too, I think is what they've mentioned.
Yeah, but he doesn't write books.
He doesn't write books.
It's all nonfiction stuff.
He writes editorials, right? Stuff like that.
And they're pretty amusing.
The British like raid the mint too, don't they? And he
do.
And he sees that it's fine.
They burn down his house, and they shoot a bunch of people and like steal a bunch of gold and get out, and it's like a big bank robbery. That part was pretty cool. William Tecumseh Sherman is in San Francisco. He's in charge of defending the port.
Grant shows up too, actually.
That's right. There's a part where Lincoln is giving a speech, and after the speech is over, this drunk hobo comes up to shake hands with Lincoln, and Lincoln realizes, oh, it's Grant. Oh, hi, Grant. It's been a while.
No, but there's a lot of stuff like that. It doesn't just end with this book. Like there's a lot of that throughout. But it's cool. I mean, they reference all sorts of stuff, which is, I like that they try and do that sort of thing.
Frederick Douglass is really, really bummed out because the world has gone in a very, very bad direction.
Yes.
For Black Americans.
But also, there's also this really interesting rivalry between Teddy Roosevelt and Custer sort of set up by this book. It does sort of continue in the later books. It's not as mentioned as heavily. But really, you should feel, you should like Roosevelt in it too, because like he's the one who's actually like, we should use machine guns and we should do this and that. Yeah. And Custer's like this stubborn idiot.
Yeah, Custer's like a villain really in this series from all I've read so far, whereas Theodore Roosevelt's a pretty cool guy.
It's interesting that they have that approach in this.
I remember like one of the things that convinced me to start reading this book is the fact that I was looking at some Wikipedia page about Judah P. Benjamin, and it said at the bottom that he was a character in How Few Remain, and I was like, oh, that might be interesting. Yeah, I'll read about that, see what he's doing in that book, and he does nothing.
So he shows up for like a little part, right?
Yeah, he shows up at the very, very end. Oh my God! We got to talk about this, is the fact that at the very end of the book, President Longstreet, who's the Confederate president, he makes a deal with Britain and France that by getting Britain and France to intervene in this war, he's got to manumit, he's got to free all the slaves in the Confederacy, which makes no sense because, as we both know, the Confederate Constitution very clearly states that slavery is protected by the Constitution.
Yeah.
Like you can't just wave your hand and say, never mind.
Exactly. And they never explain how that's resolved. And that may be just an omission on Turtledove's part. He may have forgotten that it was written into the Constitution, that it wasn't just a law that could be overturned by the legislature.
Well, maybe there's some avenue for revising the Constitution. But I mean, considering where the CSA is at this point, like winning 2 awesome victories against the United States, are they really going to be willing to give up kind of what the war was all about in the first place? Like, are they just going to give it away just because France and Britain asked nicely? Like, I don't know.
I don't know. I think it was probably more to just get the story moving.
That's true, because they kind of have to stop having slavery because it makes no sense otherwise.
That it would continue on into like the 1900s, yeah.
Yeah, what is it? Brazil was the last major country?
The 1880s, I believe, is the last major country.
Yeah, just a few years after this, and I mean, even that was pretty ridiculous and egregious at the time. Obviously, slavery has to end somehow at some point.
I mean, you may have to breeze over stuff, but overall he does a pretty good job.
Yeah.
But there's certain things he just can't, We're not writing a history book here. And
right.
We have to
it can't be 100% realistic because then it would have happened.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly. Would have happened or would have been, So I'm not going to hit an artistic choice.
No, look, this is a tiny little gripe. Turtledove did an awesome job with this book.
Yeah, we like it. It's very well done.
Yeah.
No Robert E. Lee in it, though. He's kicked the bucket.
So that's kind of like an ironic thing, is the fact that this book is called How Few Remain, when basically everyone remains except for Robert E. Lee.
I mean, even Lincoln is still alive. And
yeah.
Didn't he have Marfans or something like that?
That's a good point, yeah.
I think John Wilkes Booth is mentioned in it, too.
Oh, is he?
I think Lincoln talks about how he's a really good actor, something like that. It's stuff like that. Turtledove loves to do that. He's like, John Wilkes Booth, I think he does mention, he's like, I once saw him on the stage. He's a very good actor or something like that.
They should have in like the series after the Great War one. They should mention going to like a silent movie or something, and like he should be like, "Oh, he was great on the stage, but he sucks as a film actor" or something.
He'll probably be dead by that point.
Actually, that's a very good point.
Yeah, stuff like that. The Turtledove loves that. He just loves throwing in stuff like that. I mean, I'm not going to be too angry at that because I think it's kind of entertaining and kind of funny too. So.
Yeah. Another thing really funny about that Mormon interlude is the fact that General Pope, he suspends everyone's writ of habeas corpus, and it's really funny because Lincoln is there and he's like, "That's wrong, that's totally wrong," which is highly ironic, I'd say.
Well, considering he actually suspended the writ of habeas corpus during the Civil War, and still did because it was pretty early on in this world's timeline.
Oh yeah, huh.
Turtledove does a lot of that in these books where he'll do these sort of referential things, and maybe that it's a bit goofy at times, but you appreciate it. He's talking to his audience.
Like for instance, I think in this book at some point Theodore Roosevelt says something about, "We'll give him a hit with a big stick," or something like that, and it's like, okay, I see what you're doing, Harry. I see what you're doing.
No, I mean, it's funny. It's cool that he does that.
Also in that bit in Canada, I like how Chinese Gordon is commanding the British Army up in Canada.
Yeah, I like that.
That's pretty cool.
He likes to repeat certain things in these books, Turtledove. And like one of them is everyone talks about how when they're going to fight someone, they're going to lick them. He's like, "We're going to lick them. We're going to lick those rebs." It's like, why? It's a very bizarre.
It makes for some pretty goofy dialogue between people. Give him a good lick. Oh, we got licked. Oh.
No, but
and this continues on into the other books.
Yes,
in a big way.
But it's good. I mean, it's a good book. I think it's well worth your time to read. Obviously, it's not necessary, as we made a point earlier, for read the later books. But I would recommend that you read it because I think it's very good. Yeah.
When it comes to alternate history books, this is probably one of the best that I've read.
It's very realistic. It has an interesting structure because of that. So there's a lot of like, sometimes you'll get characters doing these like almost weird, bizarre like exposition sort of things, but they're filling in other details about the world. And they also always have a cool map at the front too, which I always liked.
Yeah.
That shows where the areas are, just because sometimes it's referencing places that you wouldn't know exactly. But
yeah,
it's good stuff. I would certainly recommend it. It's well worth it. Turtledove's one of the best out there for alternate history, so you can't go wrong with it.
Well, you can, but
that's true. I'm saying this book.
Yeah, this one in particular. I think he wrote like some kind of fantasy World War II book or something.
Yeah, where the aliens invade during the middle of it.
Oh, yeah, well, there's that one too.
Them. Don't even...
Yeah.
Yeah, we've already covered that in the bad alternate history episode. Don't need to go further into it. Well, I think that's about it for today. This is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
Have a good day, guys.